Julian tossed the custom anniversary piece onto the glass table. "This is cheap," he scoffed, adjusting his cuffs. "It looks like discount bin garbage." I looked at him. The shift was instant. Anger wasn't loud. It was clinical. "Fair enough," I said, my voice devoid of tremor or curiosity. I just turned around and walked out the door, my mind already calculating the liquidation of our life. Have you ever poured your heart into a gift only to have it insulted by someone who didn't deserve you? Share your experience in the comments below. I'm reading everyone. I drove straight to the artisan boutique downtown. My hands on the steering wheel were perfectly steady, gripping the leather with a calm, calculated force. The air conditioning hummed, cooling the interior of my car, but my mind was even colder. The city lights blurred past, but I wasn't seeing them. I was running an inventory of my life. I walked into the shop, the bell above the door chiming lightly. I placed the rejected anniversary gift on the glass counter and processed the return. I didn't offer a tearful explanation to the clerk. I didn't seek sympathy. I simply asked for the appraisal documentation and the material certificates, sliding the crisp papers into my leather folio. The transaction was clean, precise, and devoid of emotion. This wasn't a tragedy. It was an audit. By 11:51 at night, I was back at our shared loft. Julian was out, probably seeking validation at some upscale lounge, surrounded by people who bought into his hollow charm. I moved through the expansive space with absolute efficiency. Every motion was stripped of sentiment. I opened my laptop on the kitchen island and started clicking. I blocked his accounts across all social media platforms. I erased his phone number. I didn't write a dramatic farewell text. I didn't leave a note demanding closure. Total silence is a far more effective legal and emotional strategy. We had a joint credit card and a shared lease, the standard entanglements of a modern relationship. I logged into the banking portal, my keystrokes sharp and deliberate. I transferred the balance of the household expenses fund, to which I had authorized access, into my sole account, and formally petitioned the bank to freeze the joint credit lines to prevent further unauthorized debt accumulation. I drafted a formal, legally binding email to our landlord, exercising the early termination clause on my half of the lease, attaching the required fees. Love had been a subscription, and I was permanently cancelling my auto-renewal. I pulled 3 sleek suitcases from the closet and packed my belongings. I left his curated aesthetic completely undisturbed. I didn't touch his designer watches, his perfectly aligned shoes, or his collection of expensive colognes. There were no smashed picture frames, no cut-tailored suits, no screaming matches echoing through the halls. Retaliation doesn't require a raised voice. I rubbed my eyes, standing in the center of the bedroom, trying to summon even a flicker of regret for the 3 years we had spent together. But there was only the icy clarity of a bad investment finally written off. I had been the silent investor in his version of a perfect life, and the returns were utterly bankrupt. I carried my bags to the car by 12:03 in the morning. I left my keys on the granite kitchen island next to a perfectly aligned stack of utility bills. When Julian returned, he would find a perfectly intact apartment and a completely vanished partner. They aren't shocked by what they've done. They are shocked when you stop playing along. I drove to a downtown hotel, checked into a corner room, and opened my laptop again. I had an architecture firm to run. The immediate removal of Julian from my life wasn't an emotional collapse. It was the optimization of my personal resources. For the last 6 months, my life had been an exhausting, relentless dichotomy. I had fast-tracked my career through relentless specialization, becoming the youngest lead architect in my firm to oversee such high-stakes contracts. I was calculating load-bearing walls, assessing material tensile strengths, and ensuring that multi-million-dollar projects wouldn't collapse under their own weight. By night, I was hunched over my drafting table in the corner of our loft, meticulously designing Julian's anniversary gift. It was supposed to be a flawless architectural model of the first gallery where we met, cast in solid bronze and polished obsidian. I had poured hundreds of hours into the geometry of that piece, treating it with the same reverence I applied to my skyscrapers. While I was focused on substance, Julian was obsessively curating his digital brand. As the manager of a luxury car dealership, his entire existence relied on optics. His life was a continuous, exhausting performance of wealth and taste, measured entirely in followers, tailored Italian suits, and reservations at exclusive restaurants. He spent his evenings arranging the perfect lighting for his social media stories, ensuring the world saw him as a man of impeccable standards. I realize now that his high standards were a silent prison. For years, I had been operating under the assumption that if I just delivered absolute perfection, I would earn his approval. I had treated our relationship like a demanding, impossible client, constantly submitting revisions to my own personality. I wore the right clothes, attended the right galas, laughed at the right pitch, and kept my voice at the exact modulation he preferred. I had framed this daily performance as an act of love, but it was nothing more than an unpaid internship in his personal public relations firm. The architecture of our intimacy was fundamentally flawed from the ground up. It had no foundation, only a glossy, expensive facade. He didn't want a partner with substance. He wanted an accessory that reflected his curated perfection back at him. I was a structural engineer attempting to build a home out of smoke and mirrors. When I handed him that bronze gallery, I was handing him my exhaustion, my dedication, and my intellect. When he called it a discount bin piece, he wasn't just rejecting a gift. He was appraising my worth and deciding I was a depreciating asset. The realization was sharp, cold, and utterly liberating. I had spent 3 years trapped in his performance of a relationship, exhausted by the relentless demands of his insecurity. I was no longer willing to be the invisible scaffolding holding up his fragile ego. The bronze and obsidian were flawless. The design was immaculate. The defect was entirely his. As I sat in my hotel room, drafting the schematics for a new commercial plaza, my mind was sharper than it had been in years. The mental bandwidth previously occupied by Julian's impossible standards was now fully reallocated to my own ambitions. I didn't feel broken. I felt optimized. I was finally dismantling a structure that had been condemned from the start. By the 3rd day of my absence, Julian realized his carefully maintained aesthetic ecosystem had been breached. His reaction was as predictable as it was pathetic. He immediately initiated a systematic gaslighting campaign, weaponizing his social media presence to control the narrative before I could even speak. He started calling our mutual friends, including Sloane, his former partner whom I had once tolerated for the sake of his social circle, feeding them a fabricated story about how I had become completely unhinged. He posted cryptic black and white stories about people lacking class and the heavy burden of carrying a partner who refuses to elevate themselves. He projected the flawless image of a patient, long-suffering man who had finally been pushed to the brink by a hysterical, unreasonable woman. Then came the direct digital assault. Because I had blocked his number and his personal profiles, he circumvented my barriers by emailing my professional work account. His emails were a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation, layered with backhanded compliments, subtle threats, and blatant demands for my submission. "I am willing to overlook your childish outburst," he wrote in one particularly arrogant message. "We can discuss this rationally once you apologize for embarrassing me. Your behavior is beneath the standard I expect, but I'm willing to guide you back to reason." He was demanding a massive return on an emotional investment he had never actually made. He wanted me to grovel, to accept the role of the erratic, unstable woman, so he could comfortably maintain his position as the rational arbiter of taste and sanity. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical and precise. I didn't reply to a single email. I didn't defend myself to the mutual friends who texted me with feigned concern. I simply opened a secure, encrypted folder on my hard drive and began filing every piece of data. I documented every digital interaction. I took screenshots of every disparaging post, and I archived every manipulative email with timestamps and digital signatures. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. I treated his smear campaign as a hostile corporate takeover. I gathered the evidence with the same meticulous precision I used to draft city zoning applications. He had no idea that while he was busy broadcasting his curated victimhood to his thousands of followers, I was building an impenetrable legal and professional barricade. He assumed my silence was a sign of weakness, a symptom of my supposed emotional breakdown. He thought I was hiding in shame. He didn't understand that I was calculating the exact torque required to collapse his entire facade. Every post he made about my lack of class was another brick in the wall of evidence I was constructing. Every email demanding an apology was another documented instance of his toxic coercion. I watched his digital tantrum unfold with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a dying organism. He was desperately trying to maintain control of a narrative that was already obsolete. He was a manager of luxury vehicles, a salesman of hollow status. I was an architect. I knew exactly how to find the structural weakness in any foundation. And Julian's foundation was built entirely on lies. A week into my new life, I received an unexpected call from the artisan who had helped me cast the anniversary piece. I drove to his workshop on the industrial side of the city, my mind rapidly calculating variables. When I arrived, he placed the bronze and obsidian model on the scarred wooden workbench. He looked deeply uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He explained that during a routine quality check of the returned item, he had discovered something highly anomalous. The structural integrity of the piece had been deliberately compromised. The binding agent connecting the bronze gallery walls to the obsidian base had been chemically altered with a highly corrosive solvent. I stared at the metal, the icy clarity in my veins sharpening into absolute focus. The truth was far more lethal than simple rejection. Julian hadn't just insulted my taste in a moment of arrogance. He had actively, maliciously sabotaged the piece. The artisan confessed that Julian had visited the shop a week before our anniversary. He had claimed he wanted to surprise me by adding a personalized engraving to the base while the artisan was out at lunch. Instead, Julian had tampered with the materials to ensure the model would physically degrade, crack, and fail within days of me presenting it to him. This wasn't an aesthetic critique. This was a premeditated act of professional sabotage intended to completely erode my confidence. He wanted the piece to shatter in my hands so he could magnify my failure and watch me crumble. It is the insidious trap of curated perfection. He needed me to fail because my genuine competence threatened his carefully constructed, incredibly fragile superiority. A narcissist cannot simply exist alongside a successful partner. They must systematically dismantle that partner's self-worth to maintain their own illusion of absolute control. Julian didn't just want me to feel unappreciated. He wanted me to fundamentally doubt my own skills as an architect. He needed me to believe that my designs were inherently flawed, that my structural calculations were cheap, defective, and ultimately worthless. He was trying to infect my professional reality with his own deep-seated inadequacy. I methodically documented the artisan's findings. I collected the chemical analysis report detailing the solvent used, and I requested a copy of the shop's publicly recorded security footage, which legally captured Julian's unauthorized tampering with the commission. I paid the artisan handsomely for his time and integrity and placed the sabotaged piece carefully back into my leather folio. I walked out of the workshop with absolute, unwavering clarity. The puzzle was completely solved. Julian was a fraud, and I had the blueprints to prove it. I didn't feel shock. I didn't feel despair. I felt a surge of cold, undeniable power. He had handed me the exact mechanism of his own destruction. He thought he was playing a subtle psychological game, but he had committed a tangible, documented act of sabotage against a licensed professional. He had crossed the line from emotional manipulation into actionable malice. The appraisal of my worth was no longer up for debate. I had the raw data. I drove back to my office and began drafting a formal legal notice. It was Friday night, exactly 8:02 in the evening. I knew Julian's schedule with forensic accuracy. He was hosting a high-end dinner party at the Loft, entertaining 3 potential major investors and the regional director of his luxury dealership group. It was, by his own admission, his most critical networking event of the entire quarter. I checked the building directory and waited in the lobby, knowing he was hosting investors. I didn't need to break in. I walked in with the calm authority of someone delivering a final notice. I stepped into the expansive loft just as they were sitting down for the first course. The ambient lighting was perfectly calibrated, the jazz music was playing at a low, sophisticated volume, and the expensive wine was breathing in crystal decanters. Julian was seated at the head of the long mahogany table, holding a glass of Cabernet, mid-sentence in an exaggerated story designed to highlight his sophisticated palate and business acumen. He froze. The conversation died instantly. 7 high-status guests turned to look at me in unison. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't look like an unhinged woman. I was dressed in a meticulously tailored charcoal suit, my posture impeccable, my expression entirely blank. The silence in the room was absolute. heavy with sudden tension. I walked methodically to the head of the table. Julian's face rapidly drained of colour. He opened his mouth, desperately trying to deploy a charming excuse, preparing to paint me as the hysterical ex-girlfriend crashing his elegant evening. I didn't give him the oxygen to speak. I placed the thick, professionally bound dossier directly onto his pristine china plate. "This is the final appraisal," I said. My voice was quiet, perfectly even, and sharp as cut glass. I placed a single, leather-bound portfolio on his plate, the official legal dossier containing his digital signature trails, forensic evidence of his sabotage, and the formal cease and desist order. Julian looked down at the documents, his eyes darting frantically. The regional director leaned slightly forward, his gaze tracking the security photos of Julian actively tampering with the sculpture. Julian's hand trembled. The crystal wine glass clinked audibly against the mahogany table. "Natalie, this is highly inappropriate," he whispered, his voice cracking, his eyes pleading with me not to ruin his image in front of his investors. "Sabotaging a licensed architect's work to manufacture a psychological advantage is inappropriate," I replied, my tone strictly transactional. "Defaming me online to cover your own inadequacy is a major liability." I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need to hear his desperate, hollow excuses. The evidence was irrefutable. His bravado crumbled in real time. The suave, curated manager was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified man stripped of his protective facade. His prestigious guests stared at him in stunned silence, the illusion of his perfection shattering in front of the exact people he desperately needed to impress. The investors didn't wait for the end of the script. They stood up one by one, their expressions shifting from polite interest to professional distaste, as they grabbed their coats and walked out the door, leaving Julian alone in his shattered loft. I turned and walked out of the loft, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. They weren't shocked by what he had done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. The elevator doors closed, sealing his fate. I walked out into the cold night air, leaving him to face the undeniable architecture of his own deceit. 2 months later, the sky above Chicago was a brilliant, cloudless expanse of blue. I stood on the 30th floor of an unfinished commercial skyscraper, the high-altitude wind pulling sharply at the collar of my jacket and the edge of my hard hat. I had relocated my architectural practice entirely, leaving the hollow aesthetic of my past life thousands of miles behind me. My longtime professional mentor, Gretchen, had brought me onto a massive, career-defining development project, trusting me completely with the complex structural design of the building's central glass atrium. The work was incredibly demanding, intellectually rigorous, and entirely real. I reviewed the detailed blueprints on my digital tablet, watching the heavy steel beams being locked into place by the crane operators suspended high above the city streets. There were no illusions here. If a calculation was wrong, the building would fall. If a foundation was weak, the structure would ultimately fail. It was a language of absolute, undeniable truth, a stark, refreshing contrast to the curated lies I had lived with for 3 exhausting years. Julian was nothing more than a ghost in my rearview mirror. In the days following the dinner party, his professional reputation disintegrated. The company's HR department placed him on immediate administrative leave pending a formal investigation, which ultimately concluded in his termination for cause. Once the evidence was verified against the company's code of ethics, Julian was terminated for gross misconduct. The high-end investors backed away immediately, repelled by the immense financial and social liability of his character. Without his job, his curated aesthetic collapsed. He tried to reach out twice, sending lengthy, desperate emails begging for forgiveness, claiming that the immense pressure of maintaining his image had driven him to make poor choices. I routed his emails directly to my attorney's inbox. I never replied. I had permanently closed the account, and I do not reinvest my time, capital, or energy in bankrupt properties. As I watched the sprawling city stretch out below me, the traffic moving in precise, grid-like patterns, I reflected deeply on the fundamental difference between control. Control is a remarkably fragile thing, built entirely on the constant, exhausting suppression of another person's light. It requires a narcissist to constantly curate a distorted reality where they are perpetually superior, forcing their partner into a silent, shrinking box just to maintain the illusion of dominance. Love, real love, is structural support. It is the solid, unyielding ground that allows you to build upward to reach your absolute highest potential without the constant fear of the foundation giving way beneath your feet. I had spent so much of my adult life trying to polish a defective relationship, mistakenly thinking my dedication and hard work could somehow fix a man who was chemically altered to break me down. I've come to realize that you cannot outwork someone else's toxic insecurity. You cannot design a beautiful, lasting life with someone who is secretly soaring through your support beams in the dark just to ensure you never stand taller than them. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. I don't harbor rage anymore. The anger evaporated the exact moment I took my power back. Instead, I just hold a profound, icy gratitude for the moment he insulted that bronze model and showed me exactly who he was. I had to let the old, decaying structure collapse completely so I could finally clear the lot and build something capable of touching the sky. The nights are quiet now. My apartment in Chicago doesn't look like a magazine spread, but it feels like a home. There is no one critiquing my choice of coffee mugs, no one demanding I dress to match their brand when we go to the grocery store. The silence, which I once thought would be lonely, is actually the sound of my own thoughts, finally having room to breathe. I've reconnected with old friends I had sidelined to appease his jealousy. I spend my weekends at museums and drafting new concepts purely for the joy of creation. I am no longer managing a crisis. I am living a life. I look into the camera now, not as a victim, but as the architect of my own reality. If you are watching this, and you feel yourself shrinking to fit into someone else's curated aesthetic, please listen to me. Pay close attention to the subtle sabotages. Notice when your successes are met with coldness, or when your thoughtful gifts are appraised not for the love they carry, but for their status and price tag. A curated personality is just a mask, and underneath it is a dark void that will happily consume everything you have to offer. You are not a silent investor in someone else's fragile ego. You are the sole builder of your own life. The courage to walk away, to leave the keys on the counter, to block the numbers, and to step out into the cold, clean air of reality is the highest possible form of self-love. It will hurt at first. It will feel like a massive failure. But the exact moment you stop performing for someone who despises your strength, you get your entire life back. The peace that follows is worth more than any curated image. If you've ever had to build yourself back up from someone else's wreckage, I'm proud of you. Let me know in the comments, what's one boundary you're finally ready to set? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of justice.